Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Brian McClellan here with me today to talk about his brand new book, In the Shadow of Lightning, and writing fantasy and everything else that we can get into today. Um, if I haven't read the new book yet, but at being a fan of the Powder Mage trilogy and all the subsequent entries into that world, I know this is going to be amazing. I'm so excited for it. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to have you, Brian. We like to kick off the conversation with some questions to get things started. And here's a question for you: what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Phew, man, that's tough. I have I, I have a sequence of events over the course of my kind of young life
Yeah.
where I realized I was good at making stuff up. Um, I remember I think it was third grade, I want to say, that I won a story contest. I wrote like this little short story that was like 2 pages long for a writing contest for the class.
Yeah.
And my teacher loved it. She thought it was very fun, and she so I won the class one, and then she put it forward for the whole grade, and somebody else won. And I was quite bitter. But Yeah, so I remember that was the first time I tried writing anything myself, and then yeah, and I guess over time, especially once I hit high school, I started kind of filling my study halls with just handwritten whatever. And
Right.
like the first thing that I really tried to do myself was that was quote unquote original, was kind of like an angels and demons sort of multiple planes where angels with big wings were fighting these demons coming from a different plane and all that stuff. Very kind of derivative. I'm sure one out of every five people who've written anything as a kid wrote something just like it. uh,
Yeah.
but I would do that in study hall in high school, and yeah, and I eventually kind of realized, I tried to kind of get more original as I went on, and I went through the whole elves and dwarves phase. Um, I went through a period where I was doing Wheel of Time fan fiction, um, and then eventually, yeah, I kind of just eventually just realized, okay, I don't necessarily like what I'm writing, and I want to do better each time and develop and all that stuff. And I don't exactly know where kind of the switch happened where I went, I want to be a writer.
Yeah.
Um, it was probably in high school at some point. Um, but uh, but I remember because my dad is a financial consultant, and so my answer when people said, "Oh, what do you want to do for a living?" Was, "Oh, I should be an accountant."
Yeah.
Which when you're a kid you don't realize how boring of an answer that is. um,
You're
but
thinking Scrooge McDuck, just,
right, and
bags
so
of
like
money everywhere, but yeah, but none
yeah,
of it's
so
your money.
so I was kind of I went from there to realizing I wasn't good with numbers. And that's a big barrier to that sort of career, right? um and then yeah, and realizing I liked making stuff up and going from there.
What was your entry to fantasy? What was it that some people it's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Some people it's Lord of the Rings. Some people it's Disney movies. What was it that opened you up to fantastical worlds and all of that?
Ooh, yeah, again, it was a series of things. You probably my mom reading me Lion, Lich, and the Wardrobe when I was little, and then subsequently myself reading the sequels,
Right.
um, reading all the Redwall books as a kid. Um, I
Love
remember
those.
hitting, yeah, I remember hitting sixth grade, and we were assigned The Hobbit, and I loved it. And then I read all of the Lord of the Rings, and so it was definitely a progression. I think my very first like proper big modern epic fantasy I want to say it was Belgarath the Sorcerer, the book Belgarath the Sorcerer, not even the Belgariad. I think I had a friend give me Belgarath the Sorcerer, and and then I read it, and then I went back and read the Belgariad and all of that stuff, and then realized that there was this whole modern, quote unquote modern, in the
Right.
'90s, kind of, you got all the '80s fantasy that was what considered modern at the time. Um, and so I started, kind of churning through all of that sort of lighthearted Tolkien derivative stuff, and loved it. And
Yeah.
so yeah, it was a journey, but probably started with my mom reading me those books, bringing me Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. She read me, and I subsequently got into all of the Arthurian tales, all of the Robin
Sure.
Hood stuff. Um, kind of that British centric sort of folklorish kind of area.
Yeah.
It felt very fantasy to me, and I loved it all.
Fantasy writers have there are certain hallmarks that make fantasy the genre that it is, and it's world building, it's character development, it's magic systems, and there are certain aspects of it that wholly separate fantasy from every other genre. There are hallmarks that of course connect it to other things, but there are certain things about fantasy that make it just entirely its own thing. um, some authors start thinking about magic systems, and then a whole world evolves around this fantastical element of this, and then a world comes up around. Some people start thinking, and I don't know this for a fact, but you kind of think of George R. R. Martin and think that the politics of the world really informed, how A Song of Ice and Fire came about. What was it for you when you started working on the Powder Mage trilogy? Because or maybe it was just a single book to begin with, but what was it that first came to you? Was it the interesting magic system? Was it this world that's kind of reminiscent of the Napoleonic Wars? What was it that was that first idea that then was the springboard that the rest of it came about?
It was a couple ideas coming together over the course of a very short period of time. It was only a couple of weeks. Um, I saw the film Public Enemies with Johnny
Okay.
Depp as John Dillinger robbing banks in, I think it's the 1920s. And I,
Yes.
I remember walking out of the film and going, man, I really want to write a short story that's basically a ripoff of that. That's mages with Tommy guns robbing banks. I thought that sounds really cool. It could be really fun. And I thought about that for maybe a week, week and a half. And then kind of the next thing was my wife brought home from the library. She brought home the I think we were still on VHSs at that point, or maybe that's what the library had. Um, she brought home the Sharps Rifles collection, the show, not the books. Um,
Yes.
and so that is Sean Bean, young Sean Bean, as a soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. And I watched that. I watched the first episode, and by the time I finished the first episode, that idea of mages with Tommy guns had immediately kind of translated into mages with muskets. And I thought, okay, this is actually more what I'm used to, because I can blend the Napoleonic Wars with epic fantasy, which is the genre that I love. And so that kind of happened very naturally, and over the course of just a couple of days, I kind of developed that setting of Napoleonic epic fantasy into, okay, what kind of magic are we going to look at? What's the big difference in this world? And at the point I was really interested in military fantasy. I had been reading The Black Company and
Mm,
Joe
yeah.
Abercrombie's books, and I thought, okay, let's go with a military bend to it. Let's talk about black powder as being a magical component, and that kind of developed into the powder mages. And from there, I developed the world around it. And, what does this changing political landscape look like with revolutions and kings kind of getting the axe literally? And how is this going to affect a fantasy world? And what is it going to look like coming out the other side? And that's basically where that came from.
When at that time, were there many other authors that were doing this historical um, military fantasy like that? Uh, it's escaping me right now, but there's a couple of other series that loosely kind of touch on some of the same or similar world building aspects, but it's kind of a relatively new thing. Was this kind of untrodden territory at the time?
So it depends on who you ask. I've been on panels with a couple of older epic fantasy writers
Yeah.
who always get very annoyed when I talk about being at the kind of the forefront of this Flintlock fantasy
Right.
kind of wave. And they're like, oh, I wrote something like that back in the 80s, which is fine.
Right.
It didn't, clearly it didn't touch off something, and I didn't touch off anything either. I just happened to be at the very forefront. Like my book, Promise of Blood, came out like 3 months before The Thousand Names by Django Wexler.
Right.
And now you see Flintlock Fantasy, what we're 9 years later. Flintlock Fantasy is a established
Right.
subgenre of epic fantasy. Um, and it was me and Django were kind of right at the beginning of that. And then it kind of just moved forward to become an established thing. And that was pure luck. I didn't
Yeah.
know Django. We weren't writing, collaboratively or knew of each other. In fact, I panicked a little when I found out his book was coming out because I thought, oh my gosh, I'm not original. Um, because when I pitched it, when I sold it, honestly, I sold it off of the strength of both my agent and my editor saying, I have never seen anything like this. I love it. I want to get on this. And and so when it came out and I suddenly realized I wasn't that original,
Right.
then a little bit of panic. But like I said, it's become an established subgenre that every single book is different from the next. And I kind of love that
Yeah.
it's a different type of setting within a wider kind of genre of books.
Right. Right. It's so
Um,
funny to me that that inspiration can hit in two different places with two different people, and not the same, but a similar inspiration. It's almost, I don't know. It's this weird human connectedness of some sort. That things tend to be born when they're born, even if they have to be born by two different people, in different parts of the world. It's fascinating when you start thinking about how all that comes about.
it
It's
really
crazy.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's crazy. Speaking of kind of 80s, 90s fantasy, I was talking with Terry Brooks a while back, and we were talking about when he first started writing the Shannara series and how that first book is a very different book than a book that you would write today or that you could publish today. You're 150 pages into that book and nothing has happened yet. You meet characters and they're, going through, what their life is like, but there's not a whole lot of instigation that happens very early in that book.
Mhm.
And contrast that with Promise of Blood, and literally on page one, the world is upending. I mean, you drop us right into the story and right into a major conflict and instigating thing that's happening right up front. Have you thought much about kind of the changing taste and the way that people perceive the stories that you write, and how that is, constantly morphing, and we're having to change the way we tell stories?
I try not to think about it too much so I don't have a panic attack.
Yeah, it's
But
probably
I
good advice.
but it is something I do think about. And it's definitely a thing.
Yeah.
Like there's a couple of different facets to that. One is me personally, and one is the wider kind of way that people interact with books. The wider way people interact with books, I think that we're in an era where there's so much competition for your attention. You know, when I was a kid growing up in a household that didn't have television, you know, my parents, you know, we had a TV and a VHS
Yeah.
player, and I could rent things from the library or from the video store. But my parents didn't believe in, they didn't like TV. They thought it was, you know, kind of, they thought it was hokey and a bad influence and stuff like that. So I
Yeah.
didn't have television. I didn't have the internet really at that point. So there was nothing to compete for my kind of attention. And so I read a ton. And you know, kind of where we reached a point where we now have a million things competing for our attention. If
Right.
you want to grab somebody, and even someone who is used to reading and is more patient and really loves digging into these things, even those people still have, you know, a smartphone sitting next to them. They still
Right.
have the TV show they want to watch tonight. Um, and so I feel like you kind of have to jump in and get to the crux of the matter quickly. You have to snag them and bring them in quickly. And that was, you know, kind of my thoughts on getting on starting the book with a boom. I think that the execution, originally my idea was that it was going to be either towards the middle or towards the end of the book, um, and it didn't take long for me to say, actually, I think it's more interesting if we start the book with um, the overthrow of a king and then find out what the fallout of that event is, um, and the consequences of that. But for me, kind of changing that over to me personally, I do not have a very I'm not a patient person. I'm
Hmm.
not I don't have a long kind of ability to hold on to things. Even when I was a little kid, when I read an epic fantasy novel, I skimmed a lot. I skimmed, you know, if I was reading, you know, Wheel of Time, for instance, and there was a plot line I wasn't terribly thrilled with, I would just kind of flip to the end of that chapter, find out whatever pertinent thing had developed in the chapter, and then say, "Oh, okay, I don't care about Perrin right now." You know, his
Right.
plot line, you know, because yeah, that's how Wheel of Time went, is that, you know, the various point of view characters would become whiny for a book or two, or they'd
Right.
become just super boring. And
And
then eventually they would come back around and be my favorite character again. But
and then you get to
during,
book 12 and say, "Gosh, I wish I'd have paid more attention to Perrin."
yeah,
Right.
right. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I kind of did that. I would skim things. And so when I wrote Promise of Blood, I had this idea in my head of, okay, I want to write an epic fantasy because I do love epic fantasy, but I want to leave out the stuff I normally skim. I want to pace it more like an urban fantasy. I want the action to just keep going, going, going. And that got, I think, pretty good results. You know, Promise of Blood can be a little bit start and stop at times because I was
Yeah.
still very much exploring that idea. Um, and and you can see that in the reviews. I actually always love how when you get a review about something like pacing, you can have one review that says, this really, the pacing didn't work for me. It was very kind of janky. I didn't like it. And then the next review is literally, oh man, I loved how quickly this moved. I was so glad that they didn't, you know, dwell on all these things that, you know, are boring to me.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I it was a conscious decision to say, I'm I'm not interested in these long tail of, you know, getting into a character's head for 50 pages before any, you know, before any action happens, or, you know, stopping the middle of the book to have a massive feast scene, right? uh,
Right.
that spends, you know, only a little bit of time on, you know, development and intrigue, and is mostly describing food and describing characters being snippy to each other. So you know, and I, some of that stuff I loved to read even, and but my temperament as a writer is different even than some of those things that I enjoyed. And I realized over time that I was good at keeping the pacing up. And every time I try to slow down, I'm not actually quite very good at that. I'm not good at the, slow everything down and take
Right.
some time to really massage the world. It bores me, and so I move back to my normal thing.
So you had a great premise, this great idea, mages with Tommy guns that then morphs to mages with flintlock rifles, and then from there this world emerges, and then a magic system comes out of that, and you've got these giant set pieces that are really coming together to make something very interesting. But you can have an interesting world and you can have an interesting magic system, but if you don't have characters that we care about and can lock on to, then you don't have a fully formed story. Um, Field Marshal Thomas, how did you land on this character to really invest in and to allow us to see the story through his and other characters, but he's kind of the center point of this book. How did you land on him and 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 kind of how did he come up out of all of that?
When I was writing the book, because as you mentioned, Tomas is he is the center of the story.
Right.
And I tend to do that with my epic fantasies. I tend to have one point of view character who is kind of the driving force. And then the other point of view characters, they all have their own things, their own motivations, their own kind of what propels them forward in the story, but they all revolve around the central character.
Sure.
And so in the first trilogy, Tomas is that character. With him, I was writing it at that age where I think a lot of kind of young people who are interested in history latch on to the now largely debunked idea of the great men of history kind of thing. Um, and I loved this idea of a Napoleon type character, like maybe say a Napoleon who never lost the ideals and was corrupted by power. Somebody who really wanted to change the world for the better. And Tomas is someone who was from a young age was oppressed because of his sorcery,
Yeah.
and had to rise above that, and had to go through the system of politics and intrigue, and and really excel beyond anyone else. And he reached a period in his life where his wife is executed by the neighboring country, and even though he was one of the most powerful people in his country, he couldn't get his king to do anything about it. And this is years before the beginning of the book.
Right.
And so he developed as a character who has a history. I like that. The kind of the farm boy from the standard epic fantasy
Right.
kind of gets on my nerves. It's a blank slate, and I understand why it works so well as a trope, because young people can put themselves on this character.
Right.
But to me, as a writer, that's boring. I want a character who has a history, who has years of weariness. And Tomas is someone who saw victory and heartbreak and change and the lack of change, and finally said, "I'm fed up with this." And before even the book starts, he has developed a coalition of powerful people who he brings together, and then overthrows the government. And the government, as a lot of those governments tended to be, was just the nobility. It was the king
Right.
and their ministers and their private sorcerers. And Tomas has planned that out, and then he executes it right at the beginning of the book. Um, and I liked that idea of someone who has ideals, but is older and jaded and tired, and finally sees that to make those ideals happen, he's been working within the system for 40 years or something like
Right.
that when the book starts. And he just kind of realizes that to move into the modern world, he has to enact the change. He has to push the people in power out of the way. and in his case, that happens very violently. Um, and yeah, I really loved that idea of someone who is a great man and far along in their career, maybe even over, kind of over the hill. Um, and seeing how they do that, how they react to these things. And Tomas, I liked his character throughout the trilogy because he doesn't lose that. He, when the coup is finished, he turns to all these people these powerful people that he has gathered together, and he says, "Okay, I did my part. I'm not a governor. I don't want to be king. I don't want to be emperor. I want you guys to create a government, a good government, and I will
Right.
support you." Um, and we don't focus on that part because at the time I wasn't confident in kind of the writing the political intrigue very deeply. It's there, but I focus more on the military aspect throughout that trilogy, and yeah, I love that.
By choosing to have a character like Tomas who is at a point in his life when the story begins where he has all of this history that is affecting how he acts and how he responds and is driving his actions forward. Um, that is very different from the trope, like you mentioned earlier, the farm boy who becomes a hero, and we see him from having almost no history, and follow him along as he goes through trials and tribulations. But having like Tomas, a fully formed character that has been affected by so much, and then meeting that character at that point, and then you have the whole series to kind of reveal his backstory and to really paint this picture of him fully, through all of his experiences that you bring out. Um, what did you do to, like, before you started writing him? Did you have character sketches that you had worked on? Did you know all of his history, or did all of that start coming to you as you wrote the series?
I would say that it started coming to me as I wrote the first book.
Okay.
By the time I moved on to books 2 and 3, I knew who he was, and I knew what kind of a person he was and what his history was. But yeah, over the course of the first book, Promise of Blood. I've mentioned this before. Promise of Blood is a lot of me throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks.
Yeah.
Creatively, I wrote it when I was like 24. I was very young in my kind of creative development. And Tomas was one of those things that really stuck for me. And so yeah, he's very developed by the end of that book, and I really loved that. Um, and and I loved that, giving him blind spots, because everyone has them, even very
Sure.
experienced older people. And for Tomas, his blind spot is his son, who is one of the other point of view characters, Taniel.
Right.
uh, and and I really liked that development from just me saying, okay, I want a Napoleon-like character, to jumping into the more personal aspect that he, as someone who is very successful and driven in a public sense, his private life is non-existent.
Right.
He's not affectionate towards his son. He raised his son in the military, um, and making that kind of a complicated failure in some ways on his part, and have him not really notice until later. And I don't know. I was that those it made it made him more complex than just someone who's incredibly competent.
When you first began writing The Promise of Blood, and this world was becoming alive to you, did you see the series potential that it eventually became? Could you see past the first book to what this world grew into?
Yeah. In fact, funny enough, early pitches. I was. This is actually a recurring thing in my career, privately,
Yeah.
is that I always aim way too high with new books and new sequels. I
Yeah.
always have 1,000 grand ideas for book 2, book 3, whatever. Um, and with Promise of Blood, it's funny because the original pitch for books 2 and 3 actually looked nothing like what the books 2 and 3 we got were. It looked very much like what the following trilogy ended up being. I
That's
think
so
that
funny.
yeah, I think that the original pitch for what became the Crimson Campaign, book 2, included a Dainese invasion and way more about Capol and lots more development. And as I tried to write that, which I mean, I never learn. I keep doing this to myself every time I write a new trilogy. As I tried to write that, I realized, okay, this is way too ambitious for what I've already set up. I need to scale back. I need to focus on the things that I have already put in motion
Right.
rather than introducing tons of new stuff. And so that was a very much in the moment thing where I had a pitch. I thought I knew what I was doing with the trilogy, and then I realized it's way too big.
Yeah.
That's not working the way I want it to. Um, and and then totally wrote something different. But then the ideas that I had for all that ended up becoming, the following trilogy.
Well, you've got all these ideas. They've got to go somewhere. And the great thing about fantasy is that readers are conditioned um, to want series. Not all genres are like that. Thriller writers, standalones are definitely the kind of the norm for that genre. But when you're talking fantasy, people expect there to be a book 2, book 3, and then maybe a trilogy of trilogies, and all of that. So that definitely helps, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and this is a weird thing because you see fans argue about this constantly of
Yeah.
I'm so sick of series. I want standalones. I want to be able to eat something, read something like in bite-size kind of. I don't
Right.
want to have an 8-course meal. I want to just have a sandwich.
Yeah.
um and it's funny because you see those people argue, but the truth is that fans, as a whole, they
Yeah.
adore those big worlds.
Right.
And this works because for both authors and fans, it works very well because once you, as an author, have spent huge amounts of time developing a world in that first book, you've done all of this world building in your own head, in your notes. You've created this kind of vast and deep um, system of economics and traditions and countries and history and all this stuff. Once you've done that, you don't want to only do one book.
Right.
Oftentimes, some authors do. That's fine. But oftentimes you say, "Oh, I've put all this work in. I really want to do more in it." And you're lucky as an author because most readers, once they've put the work into learning all of this stuff, they want to stick with it.
Right.
Um, and I've found that to be the case, and I am that type of person. Once both as a reader and a writer, um, I want to stick around in that world and spend more time in it. I've my next book is out next week as of recording, and it's a whole new universe. And I still, when people come to me and say, "Oh, well, I wanted more Powder Mage," I tell them, "Okay, I was burned out on Powder Mage. I'm moving on. I've got a new contract. I'm doing more stuff." But I never say I'm not going to go back to Powder Mage
Right.
because
Right.
it's a world that I still love. And maybe someday I'll look at it and say, "Oh, I really want to write something new there."
Yeah.
Maybe I won't, but
Yeah.
but the chances are pretty good that I'll say to myself someday, yeah, let's do, even a standalone, let's do
Yeah.
something, a new adventure of some kind.
Well, and even though a series is very popular with readers and is successful, burnout is a very real thing. You feel like I've told all the stories I can tell in this world right now. It's a well developed world. It still has so much potential, but I need to take a vacation to another world for a little while. What was that feeling like for you? When did you realize, okay, I need to step away from Powder Mage for a little bit? And then When did this new idea start start working on you? And did you feel like you were cheating on Power Mage a little bit when you started thinking about the new series?
Yeah, I mean, you do get that kind of, I'm daydreaming about something new, and you're
Right.
like, oh, I'm still under contract. I felt more like I was cheating on my publisher, my editor, because I was like, because I think I was writing what I call book six. It's the third book in the second trilogy of Powder Mage, and in my head, it's book six. But I was working on book six, and I had I was in this weird position where I had kind of written the second trilogy. I knew that I wanted to either write it as 3 books or 5 books, and then my editor left, and so I was kind of
Mm,
orphaned as an author. This is a thing that happens pretty
yeah.
frequently. My editor went to a different company, and the editor I was assigned, she was very competent, she was very good at what she did, but I wasn't one of her acquisitions. um and so it's this weird thing that happens with authors where I suddenly realized, okay, my maybe writing 5 books in this series, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I'm just with the complications of having my editor leave, that kind of that accentuated my burnout of the world, and I just said, okay, I'm going to wrap up all these storylines in book 3. I'm going to start working on something new. Um, and and so yeah, and so I once I had made that conscious decision, it kind of my just for fun, I kind of had evenings, driving home at 1 o'clock in the morning from game night was my time to think and to have these little daydreams about what I'll do next. Um, and I don't think I wrote anything down for quite a long time until I was well done with Powder Mage. But I definitely started thinking about it.
So the new series is called Glass Immortals, and book one is In the Shadow of Lightning. Um, Very provocative titles, both for the series and for the new book. What is going on, and how? What are the differences that we can expect from this new series as opposed to the Powder Mage? Is it a completely different world? Is there any bleed over at all?
No bleed over at all.
Okay.
There's bleed over in theme. Uh,
Okay.
you know, I didn't want to change things so much that my existing readers didn't recognize what I was doing.
Sure.
It is still a Flintlock fantasy. Um, the military aspect is still very much there.
Okay.
One of our points of view is still a soldier, and another point of view is a commander, an off and on commander. um, and I spent quite a lot more time in this book on the political intrigue
Okay.
and the interconnectedness of the world. Glass Immortals takes place in this world in which magic is industrialized. Um, there is a type of sand, a special type of sand that is mined, and once it's mined, it is refined by these glass engineers that I call siliciers, into sorry, my cat is on my desk knocking things off right now. He clearly wants to be shown his food. Um, so it's so these siliciers, they refine the cinder sand into something called godglass, and it's these little baubles that you hold, you put in piercings, and depending on what went in to this the imperfections in the cinder sand, the little bits of whatever kind of like mercury or magnesium or whatever, depending on that, it changes what the godglass does. And godglass accentuates qualities of a person. So forge glass is one of the types of godglass, and it accentuates um, sorry. Forge glass accentuates strength and speed, It hardens the body. It makes you faster, stronger. And it's something that's used by soldiers. It's used by teamsters. It's used by anyone who needs extra strength for something, including kind of the lowest rungs of society. Wit glass is another one. That one accentuates your mental capacity. It makes you think faster. It makes you able to kind of calculate much better. And that's used by politicians. It's used by commanders, strategists. And so you have all these different ones. The idea was basically that there is an infinite variety of god glasses. And in book one, we meet, I think, 10 different ones that are the most common in society. And so God Glass is the magic system, and it's not just the magic system; it's the economic system that the entire world is built on. And so we meet at the beginning our crux character, as I described before, the character that everything revolves
Yeah.
around, is a young man named Demir Grappo, who is a child prodigy who failed. He fails in the prologue. He fails to a heartbreaking extent, and he has a mental breakdown, and he leaves. He leaves the capital. He leaves a life of privilege, and then the book starts out in chapter one with him finding out that his mother has been murdered, and that the cinder sand that has been mined and that runs this entire kind of god glass economic system is running out. It's almost mined out. It's like if we suddenly found out that we're pretty much out of oil.
Wow.
And so he has these dual problems that force him out of his self-exile, and he has to come home. He has to take his place as the head of this tiny little guild family, and try to figure out how to keep society together and also take revenge. And that's the driving force of this novel and of the trilogy.
Those the years where you were thinking about this series, was it the magic system that you were thinking about, and how you could develop that, or was it the society built around this magic system and the economy that comes out of that? What was that instigating factor for you?
It was all of the above. I tend to think about multiple facets at a time, and I was listening a lot to the Revolutions podcast. I was very interested. I will always be very interested in the 1800s of our own world, and the way that society changed so much over the course of such a small amount of time, both politically, technologically, um, socially, and and so I was juggling all of these different ideas and trying to distill them down from these grand things into something that a reader could actually comprehend and that I could put into words. And so yeah, I was developing. Once I figured out the God Glass and what I was going to do with that, then the world kind of started swirling together naturally. Um, I like I said, I love kind of history, and I love taking aspects of different parts of history. I describe this world is it's almost it is the British Empire at its height in kind of that early 1800s. The British Empire at its height, if it was run by kind of the thuggish Roman Republic families, like
Oh,
Julius Caesar
wow.
came from.
Right.
Uh, and I liked this idea of a grand modernized fantasy world, but the politics are stuck in this very almost mafia-esque sort of big families that are clinging to power and constantly squabbling. And I take Demir, our main character, and put him as a minor guild family patriarch. And But someone who, when he was younger, everyone knew him because he was a genius. He was a child prodigy, and his mother was a political reformer who everyone knew and respected, and Demir was basically her. I actually kind of did the same thing. You rip yourself off a lot when you're an author. I did a lot of the same thing with Demir and his mother that I did with Taniel and Tomas in Powder Mage, which is taking kind of almost a celebrity person as the older member of the family, and then having their child become, through both their own skill and their parents' kind of machinations,
Yeah.
become a celebrity in their own right, in their field. And Demir is very much that. Demir is someone who, at the beginning of the book, after the prologue, is haunted by his own kind of childhood genius, and I really liked exploring that idea of what if you take someone who was going to be a great man of history, and you have them fail part way into their quest, and then see how years later, a decade later,
Yeah.
how that has affected them. What kind of a person comes out of that?
That's fantastic. I cannot wait to dig into it. We are recording this on June 14th, and a week from today, the book comes out, right?
Yes.
So excited. Brian, do you have a plan for where the series is going? Obviously you do, but is it going to be as big a world as Powder Mage was? What are your future plans for this series?
I mean, at the moment, it is just a trilogy. That's what the contract is that I have. I don't
Just
know.
a trilogy.
I,
Just
I
a trilogy. Yeah.
just a trilogy.
Yeah.
I don't know where it will go from there. In terms of scope of the world, I think it's probably bigger than Powder Mage.
Nice.
Um, I like I mentioned before, Promise of Blood was a lot of me throwing shit at the wall to see what stuck.
Yeah.
I didn't do a lot of pre-prepared world building for Promise of Blood. I kind of did it on the fly. With Glass Immortals and In the Shadow of Lightning, I did a lot more prep. I put way more work into kind of the developing the universe than I did with Powder Mage, and I hope it shows. I hope that it kind of comes across, and so I think it's a bigger world, with bigger, kind of grander. That's tough to say, but bigger things going on, more depth to what's happening, and who knows, maybe it'll turn into a bigger series. Maybe it'll only be a trilogy. As a writer, you kind of have to juggle the creative impulses and the ideas, the million ideas that you have in your head, with what your publisher wants. If the
Right.
book flops, then it's going to be a trilogy at best. uh but if they come back and ask me for more, I certainly, it's a world that I have invested a lot into and I really
Yeah.
love, and I would love to play with it for the next 6 or 8 years or whatever, but we'll see.
I love it. In the Shadow of Lightning, Glass Immortals Book 1 will be available everywhere June 21st. Go pre-order it on Amazon now, or go to your local bookstore. Let them know that you're looking for the book as soon as it releases. Support local books. However you grab it, go get it. I'm assuming hardcover, Kindle edition, and audiobook on release day.
Yes, a little bit complicated. If you have a lot of British fans that watch, the hardcover's not out until the end of July,
Okay.
but ebook, audiobook is available. I sell signed hardcovers from my website, that's available. But yeah, everything in US and I believe Canada is all out next week. And the digital stuff is accessible, I think, pretty much worldwide in English territories next week. So.
And you've got a fantastic website, as you mentioned, where you can learn all about the series, learn about you, and you've got a podcast of your own that you do, which is phenomenal. I love it. Tell people where they can find all that stuff.
Yeah, so my podcast is Page Break with Brian McClellan, and it is me having casual conversations with other creative professionals. I've been trying to do more than just authors. It's mostly authors, but I get some actors, I get agents, I get
Nice.
YouTubers, a variety of creative people that I just talk about the challenges of being a creative professional in the modern world, and it's kind of fun. We meander, but yeah, it's meant to be a casual, fun, sit down and relax with a couple of authors or a couple of creative pros. And so that's Page Break with Brian McClellan. It's anywhere on the podcast apps that you look for, or go to my website, brianmcclellan.com, and you'll find it on there.
Excellent. Brian, it's been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure.